Introduce you.
Okay, all right. Yeah, Ollie's the other person you're doing.
Sorry,
I know your name.
All right, guys. We just want to welcome Pastor Alonzo Johnson, and he is come to speak to us on high recommendation from two people that have known him. And we really want to give you a good sense of the community. We know we've heard a little perspective from Alonzo. But we want you to hear his perspective as we go out and you engage with people. So I was talking to him on the phone, and I was like, this is what our cause, our speaker normally talks about. And he's like, well, I'm not cause, but I would talk about this. And I'm like, oh, yes. Okay. So I knew he was going to do a great job for you. So thank you, and just welcome him.
I feel like I'm getting ready to go for a checkup or something like that. I'm intimidating. I have that white coat syndrome where I get the presence of doctors. I think they're figuring out there's something wrong with this guy. But thank you for having me, and I look forward to just sharing a little bit about who I am. I born and raised in the city of Philadelphia. I was born and spent my early years in West Philadelphia. Up until about 6 years old, and then my mom moved me to the projects in North Philadelphia. And usually when I say I spent my early years in West Philadelphia, some people start thinking immediately about Will Smith. That's a part of contextualization, right? I understand who comes from Philly, where they come from. But my formative years were spent in the projects in North Philadelphia, Raymond Rosen Projects in North Philadelphia, which was a low-income project where it made it feasible for my single mom to raise us on a public school education, on public assistance, and all of those different things until the crack epidemic happened. And so when you're a kid growing up, you don't see things as they really are. You kind of have these colored, you see everything through a TV screen or through your favorite athletes. And then when you reach about 12 or 13, you begin to, reality starts setting in that something is broken, something's not right. And why are these things the way they are? And then you begin to realize, okay, upward mobility is going to be a little bit different. Didn't grow up in a Christian home, religious at all. And then your friends start experimenting with things. They start bringing things from their homes and things that they learned, and you can start getting exposed through your friends. Well, I got exposed to drugs at an early age. I hate to say marijuana is a drug because now they say it's medicinal and all that other stuff. But when I was younger, it was weed. You get high off it. So it was cigarettes, weed, drinking, a little bit of wine, which gave way to the crack epidemic, which was crack cocaine. And when crack cocaine hit the urban context, it ravaged the urban context. It did a lot of damage. What we do now with the heroin addiction. What people do now with that is they treat the person. Then they incarcerated a lot of young people. And when they looked at it as it's being the evils of society because it primarily affected people that look like myself. So we had high incarceration. At that time, the incarceration rate shot up, and a lot of things happened systemically that didn't make the urban context better, but people wanted to be safe. So it just, in fact, I'm not a political person, but I still hear ringing in my ear some of the things that politicians said when I was a teenager to combat the drug issue. Hillary Clinton said that they were predators. Nancy Reagan was saying, this is your brain on drugs, and just say no, and all these little slogan things that we laughed at because we were thinking. They have no idea, and this is what I want to talk about. They have no idea what's going on in our context. Yeah. And it's not until you put your feet in the neighborhood that you get the feel for what's going on. So as I said, at the age of 16 was when I was introduced to crack cocaine. And when crack cocaine hit me, it totally took me into its grips and ravaged my life. At the age of 19, a friend of mine put his feet in my context and came into the project, and he shared the gospel of Jesus Christ with me. And when he shared Jesus Christ with me, it was because he was a friend who understood my context that the gospel really changed my life. But the question was, what next? okay, yeah, I was a Christian, I was on my way to heaven, but the damage and the ravages of sin that was done in my life, I was thinking, okay, now what happens from here? And he was like, well, I cannot disciple you in this context. I got to get you out of here. So I moved in with him, and I went to a middle-class black church in Mount Airy, just short of Chestnut Hill. And I thought I was dreaming. I thought the Cosby Show was a myth. I thought, no way. But when I went into this black church, I saw middle-class black people, kids going to college, and I'm 19, I'm going to this place, I'm thinking, where have you all been? You know what I mean, what's going on? I've never seen anything like this. The problem was, I thought that the gospel, when I went to that context, because I changed from an urban context to a more suburban context, and when I went into that context, I thought, well, the gospel was about upward mobility. And so, you know, when the Lord delivered me from drugs, took the taste of drugs away from me, I thought, okay, I'll just go to school, and I'll get much education as possible. I'll find me a nice wife, we'll have some kids, we'll move into the first, second, or third layer of suburbs, and we'll live happily ever after, and we'll go to heaven and forget about the hood. Well, I was doing something called Urban Family Council, which when we were going into public schools with a friend of mine named Jill Page.
I know Jill Page.
No, I'm just joking. So I was working with her in the public school system, and we were talking about healthy families. And so we were going and we were talking about God's idea of what sex is, God's idea of family. We were talking about all these different things. And I was standing in front of the class sharing, and I looked out because we were going to Philadelphia public schools. All of a sudden, I was looking at myself because of the amount of students in the Philadelphia public school system that kind of looked like me. I was thinking, what's going on here? And as I began to share and talk about family and boldness and all these different things in the classroom setting, now mind you, we weren't using the Bible, we were using some biblical principles. And what got through my heart was one young person raised his hand. It was a little boy, I think he was in the 5th grade. And he raised his hand. And I was waxing eloquent, talking about all these different things about the family, God's ideal for the family, but I wasn't saying God. He raised his hand and he says, will you be my father? And it hit me because I saw my father 4 times in my life. The last time I saw him was on my deathbed, and I saw what was going on, and I said, oh no. If we don't lean back into the brokenness, and I believe that in those broken places, God gets the greatest glory. And if I keep moving further away, what's going to happen? So I went back to my suburban church or middle-class black church, and I said, I think I know what God has called me to do. At that time, I was a youth pastor at the church, and I said, I think God has called me to plant a church in North Philly where I grew up at. And he said, why would you want to do something like that? That doesn't make any sense. And let me let you in on a little secret. I'm married cross-ethnically. My wife is from Des Moines, Iowa. She grew up in the middle class, white family. When I started dating her, it was like these two worlds don't go together. You can't come out of a drug addiction, equivalency diploma, bachelor of science and all of that. But I hadn't even had a bachelor of science yet, and marry a young lady who just got a master's in counseling. These two worlds don't go together. But all I want to tell you guys today is, in the medical field, I want you to know the gospel is the power of God. And what Paul was talking about in Ephesians chapter 2 is that there is no law that divides us any longer. And how we walk out that has great implications for how we share the gospel. Because if we come into it with all of our baggage and all of our cultural approaches to what we think the gospel means, we will sully it. And we'll make it about us and not about what God wants to do in the world. And so when we get how powerful the gospel is and that it's transformative and it wants to change hearts, but it not only wants to change hearts, it wants to change minds, and not just minds, but it wants to restore what the enemy has taken, I think we'll finally get it. And in your field, you're dealing with physical implications of the ravaged sense of blood pressure affects people that look like me. A lot of things. If you look at the statistics, You say, well, what's going on? Well, there are food deserts in a lot of these countries, a lot of these cities, particularly predominantly Philadelphia. So that means when I say a food desert, where I live at in Montgomery County, I can hit Giant, I can hit Whole Foods, I can hit a number of spots. I have transportation, I can get all over. In certain communities, the supermarket might not be for blocks and blocks away if there is a supermarket. So how do you get healthy food? So they eat at corner stores, poppy stores. So these are things that you need to know when you enter into a context. You say, well, how can I bring a holistic approach to this context? So when I say, so I share a little bit about myself, and I'll say my name again. I'm Alonzo Johnson. I'm married to Rhonda Johnson. We'll be married for 24 years next month. We have 4 children. Actually, I have 5 children. My wife and I have 4 children because I left out a part of my story that when I was 16 years old, the very year that I got addicted to crack cocaine was the very year that my son was born. I was a teen father. And so that's another part. But I don't want to deal with all of that. What I'm saying is my wife and I have 4 children. My oldest son, Isaac, is in the 11th grade. Daniel is in the 10th grade. Caleb's in the 9th grade. And I have one daughter, Abigail. Yeah, that's my baby girl. Abigail's in the 8th grade. So she came out of elementary school and went to virtual school in the 7th grade, so her junior high years just started with the pandemic. So God has been good, He's restored a lot of things, and I think legacy and cycles can be broken because of the gospel. When I ask you what is contextualization, what would you say? And I want to try to make this interactive. When I say contextualization, what pops in your mind? Contextualization. I would say it's a big word, but you guys are married people, so know a lot of big words. Contextualization.
I immediately think about like the incarnation and how Jesus incarnated into particularity into the Jewish context, and how the gospel itself manifests itself in particularity and speaks to, although it's universal in scope, it incarnates itself in its context, and that looks different. But
it's good. You just summed it up really, really beautifully with Christ. Because he's fully human, fully Jewish, and he lived in that context for 30 years before he really started his ministry. That's incarnation. A lot of times when we come into a context, we want to fix it real fast, but we don't realize Jesus existed as a Jew for 30 years before he really started his earthly ministry, which was 3.5 years before he went to the cross. So he summed it up very beautifully. Any other thoughts other than that? Incarnation or contextualization. And I have an article from a gentleman named Ed Stetzer. And Ed Stetzer says, when he writes, what is incarnation or what is contextualization? I'm saying incarnation. This is presenting the gospel in a culturally relevant ways. Contextualizing involves an attempt to present the gospel in a culturally relevant way. He pulls on a definition because we're talking about culture now. So when we talk about in a relevant way, then we start getting into these ideas of different cultures. So somebody tell me a culture, or what does culture mean to you? So we're talking about contextualization and then trying to make it relevant to a particular culture. So I tell you something that means culture.
It's like a collection of traditions, practices, styles, almost personalities of communication.
Okay. Sometimes we attribute right and wrong to different cultures. So if you come into a culture and we can say that's wrong, but that's how those people have been living. The question is, what did the gospel say? What did the gospel trump culture? But it takes a while to get there, because they've been living in these norms for a while. Like I would say, I'm a product of the hip hop culture because I'm from the time it was started, I would say. But it's changed over time. And then you have to look at the elements of that culture and you have to say, what is this about? What was the purpose of it when it started? And where is it at now? There are many types of things that we need to think about before we begin to talking about how we introduce the gospel into a context. So Stetzer pulls off a guy by the name of Harvey Kahn. Harvey Kahn, on the Evangelical Dictionary of Missions. And Kahn writes this. He says, "We use the term culture to refer to common ideas, feelings, and values that guide community and personal behaviors." He says that organize and relegate what the group thinks, what the group feels, and does about God, the world, and humanity. It explains why the Sawi, and I might pronounce this wrong, S-A-W-I, Sawi people of Iran, Jaya, regard betrayal as a virtue. So they say to betray somebody is a virtue. It undergirds the Korean horror at the idea of Westerners placing their elderly parents in a retirement home. Korean, I don't know if you have any Korean people here, but to them, you would never put your elders away. They mean too much to the family. To them, that's a cultural idea, the veneration of their ancestors. It is the climate of opinion that encourages an Eskimo to share his wife with a guest and hides the wife of an Iranian fundamentalist Muslim in a body-linked veil. The closest New Testament approximation of culture is cosmos, or world, but only when it refers to language-bound, organized human life. He talks about 1 Corinthians 14:10, or the sin-contaminated systems of values, traditions, social structures of which we are a part of. So the text I wanted to share with you to help us springboard into some type of discussion is I want to look at Matthew 9:35-38. And then I want us to look at Luke 10, where Jesus sends out his disciples and he tells them what to take and what not to take. And all of us are missionaries. If we follow the model that this young man pointed out, that if Jesus said, "As the Father sent me, so now I send you," where are we going? When we go and we're sent into a world, how are we going and how are we engaging as citizens of heaven? Because as citizens of heaven, what we're called to do is when you go into a certain place and you put your feet there, you are a representative of the kingdom of God. And you begin to push back darkness in places that you've never gone before. Because you represent God in the places that He called you to. There's an organization at Temple Hospital called Cradle to the Grave. And whenever I have young people that come to learn about the city of Philadelphia, I take them to a lot of places. I take them down to the art museum. And when you go down to the art museum, you can stand and you can look down the parkway and you see all these flags, these different flags that represent different countries. And I say, Philadelphia is a diverse city. And all of those flags represent a group of people that have a population in the city of Philadelphia. It's a very diverse city. But then I also say Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. And one neighborhood can be completely different than another neighborhood. And you have to know that, because if you do something in one context and then you try to do that same thing in another context without learning what's going on, you won't know what's happening. So you have to have the ability to see. So if you look at Matthew chapter 9, verse 35-38, and I know I'm on the clock, right? I'm on the clock. Now I can look out at the neighbor like the sun been beating on them all day. I know I'm on the clock. Matthew 9:35-38 says this. It says, and I thought I heard pages turning, but that's a good thing. So Matthew 9:35-38 says, Jesus went throughout all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. So here's Jesus He's doing ministry at a very frenetic pace. He's healing. The Bible says all kind of sickness and disease, and he's going about. And then all of a sudden, something happens. What happens as he's doing all of this ministry and he's healing all these diseases? What do you see happening in this text? Somebody tell me. What do you see happening? Something happens as he's going from towns and villages, he's teaching in synagogues, he's proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, he's healing every sickness and disease, and then something hits him. The Bible says in verse 36, those first few words in 36. That's right. He looked out and he saw. First thing, I think if you're going to do a healthy contextual ministry, you have to see what's going on. You got to have eyes to see. And I'm not talking about eyes that just see things, but you got to see beneath the surface. As doctors, I'm sure you understand. And you can look like a perfectly healthy person, but when you put that x-ray on somebody, it can reveal some things that you have the ability to say, this is not good. You got to be able to see what's going on. And it's the same thing in a context. You need to be able to see that things didn't just get like this overnight. And if you think you're going to fix what took all this time to get like this overnight, then you're not seeing things the right way. And so one of the things that I learned about as I was going, and as I began to study urban ministry at Missio, is that how these systems affect things. So when we look at, has anybody here ever heard of the school to prison pipeline?
Yeah.
When you think about the school to prison pipeline, and because I was working in a public school, and I still work in a public school, I work at a school called Central High School. Central High School is one of the best schools in the city of Philadelphia. Everybody want to be in the center. It's a public school, but it's a magnet school. When you get in there, it's hard because it's a preparatory school. But that's one school in the city of Philadelphia. Most of the schools are broken. And if you can't read by the third grade in the public school system in Philadelphia, not just the city of Philadelphia, but the public school system as it exists in our country, if you can't read, there's no mechanism in place that you can catch up. And then what we need to understand is, based on that statistic, based on that number, they will figure out by looking at the public school system the number of students that are not reading at grade level, and they will build prisons based on that number. Because if you can't read by third grade, they're saying it's a strong likelihood that you're eventually going to end up incarcerated. So instead of addressing a problem, what we do is build prisons as if that's going to solve the issue in the richest country in the world. But then, that's not just about how our government or how these systems work. The question is, how does the church see what's happening? And then how do we address it? And if we're serious about the gospel and the power that it has, and we see what's going on in society, then we have to understand the importance of engaging a society that's broken. Well, what Jesus did was he said, he's doing ministry at this frenetic pace, and for the first time, it appears to me, he stops and it says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion. He had compassion. And when he talks about compassion, that's like being moved, that's like your guts being moved. Or you're being so disturbed internally that you now have to think about doing things a different way. So at this point in Jesus' ministry, he's like, okay, I'm 100% God, but I'm 100% man. You know, and so at this point, there has to be a change in my ministry. And for the first time in his ministry life, the Bible says he stops, he sees, he's moved with compassion because the people are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then he says to his disciples, and this is when he invites them to join him on mission. And the first thing he asks them to do, he says this, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. he says, ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. First thing he did was he saw, and the second thing he did was told his disciples, he invited them to pray that God would raise up workers that will go into the harvest field. And if you're not prepared to go to do this level of work, then, you know, it's going to be difficult because you're going to see things that are going to break your heart. My wife is a social worker, and that's one of the reasons that I fell in love with her. We worked at an organization called Bethlehem Children's Home in the early times of our relationship. And as a social worker, I can remember one time because I was working in staff at called house parent. I was working as a house parent, and she was doing social work with other. So when the students are in these homes, they're not with their parents. And so she would have to go and get signatures because the parents still have rights for them. And she would have to go get signatures. Well, this kid needed to go to camp, and the only way to go to camp is if they got a signature. So my wife was like, we weren't married at the time, we were just dating, but she was like, I gotta go down to West Philadelphia Projects on 42nd and Market, into the projects, probably the only last projects that's standing. And I gotta go get signatures for this kid in order to go to camp. I tell you, my wife is from the Midwest. I'm from Philadelphia. I'm like, you can't go down there. What are you talking about? You going to the project? You can't. She's like, well, if I don't go there, then this kid won't go to camp. And I'm like, well, you can't just walk up in the project by yourself. Well, that's what social workers do. I think she completely understood. She may have understood more than me that it's not about the darkness, it's not about the brokenness, it's about this child. And if this child is going to have an opportunity, it can't be because of the failure of his parent. So I have to go. So I said, well, you can't go by yourself, and I went with her. Well, the elevator was broken. So we had to walk up the steps in the project. I told you, I grew up in a project. But I'm walking in a context with my soon-to-be wife, and she's acting like this is normal. We get into the apartment, the lady has probably 6 or 7 other kids in the house, one is in the system, and there are roaches all over the place. And I'm thinking, I grew up in the projects, I know what roaches look like. I'm thinking, I'm not sitting down. Well, guess what my wife does? So she sits down. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me, I ain't sitting on that couch. What she was doing was, she was building relationship and sitting in the context so that she could get eyeball to eyeball with this parent. Treating that parent with dignity, loving that parent where they were, so that she could say, "This is, yeah, I want to love your kid, but I'm also concerned about you." And what she was doing was helping me to see that, hey, this thing is not about how we feel or anything like that. It's about what God has called us to do. And when you go into these situations, you got to go armored up. You got to go ready. Because you don't know what God is going to do. Now, I just told you something. I said, God delivered me. And here I am in a context, and I'm acting like it's foreign. And that's how I grew up. And I'm talking about, I'm not even 5-6 years removed from abject poverty at the time. But all I had was a little sniff of suburban life. And I'm acting all of a sudden like I'm too good to go back to the projects. Sometimes we can get like that. And what Jesus is calling his disciples into is he's saying that there's a harvest out there and it's plentiful, but the workers are few. And the reason the workers are few is because we've grown accustomed to having the things that we think are necessary for life. All of the things that we believe we need for life, we're not willing to lay those things down. And so, let me just share with you one of the things that Stetson says, and then I want us to look at Luke chapter 10 real fast, and because I think it's really interesting what Jesus tells his disciples that he wants them to take and what he tells them not to take. So I gotta find that quote that he stated. He said, so he gives caution and dangers. He says there are 2 dangers to avoid when you're looking to do contextualization in the context. He says, I warn that contemporary Christians must avoid two pitfalls in regards to contextualization. Here's another big word that I probably won't pronounce correctly. And this is why you hear Kaz and Pastor Gabe, because they can say those words. Get that on camera too. The two words are obscuratism and syncretism. Those things are dangerous. Obscuratism occurs when a person confuses the gospel with some idea or expression external to the gospel. For example, he says, a person might believe that certain musical genres or evangelical methods are essential features of the Christian faith. So what we do is we say, we go into a context, we serve, but if we don't proclaim the gospel, we haven't done faithful gospel ministry. Or if we go in and we preach the gospel, and somebody might say, you know what? You preached the gospel, but you didn't meet a need. And what I'm going to contend is that they both go together. They both go together. But if we're not careful, what we do is we add things to the gospel. We confuse the gospel. We start saying these methods are necessary features of the Christian faith. And he says that's obscuratism. It occurs when a person confuses the gospel with some idea or expression external to the gospel. And he says syncretism, and this is where we at right now today. Syncretism is where we are right now in our country. It is the opposite error. It is the mixing of Christianity with something else. In an attempt to contextualize the gospel, some Christians might uncritically accept the religious conviction of a particular culture. Should they believe and present these religious convictions in a manner that distorts or denies the gospel, they are guilty of syncretism. And I'll just pick on one and say that we've married our American culture to the gospel. Syncretism. And that's how we can get a lot of crazy things that happen when we start talking about God and country. It can get into a real slippery slope when we start merging things with our gospel and we start saying things like, we're a Christian country. We might have some beliefs in our foundation, but a Christian country, I think that's a huge stretch. And we're coming up on celebrating the 4th of July. And as Americans, we should celebrate. But I'm saying when we start talking about what kingdom is and what country is, we need to be very, very careful. Because if not, we'll take these American ideas and we'll make them a part of what God has called us to do. And God's kingdom always trumps those things that we talk about. You tracking with me? We got to be very, very careful. So let's look at Luke right fast. So Jesus says to pray to the Lord of the harvest that he send out laborers into his harvest field. And then he tells them this, and this is where I think we'll have a little bit more interaction. In Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, and then we can flesh out the rest right here. It says this. Luke 10, starting at verse number 1. After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them out 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. So he starts ready. He's going to send his disciples out. How is he sending them out? In 2, right? What kind of ministry did y'all do today? Y'all just out cleaning?
We did vaccine education on the streets.
Oh, excellent.
And we did social determinants and home surveys and asking folks about the impact of the experience.
And y'all all stay together like this?
We went out to it.
Oh, okay. all right. I'm not too far off there. Okay. All right, so 2 by 2. He told them the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest. He said, go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. Do not take a purse or a bag or sandals. Do not greet anyone on the road. When you enter a house, first say peace to the house. If someone who promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will return to you. Stay there, eating, drinking, whatever they give you. You heard that? Okay. Don't think that. Even if a roach drop out of the ceiling, it's eat it. No, I'm just joking. He said, peace will rest on you. If not, it will return to you. Stay there, eating and drinking whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages. Do not move around from house to house. When you enter a town and are welcome, eat whatever is offered to you. Heal the sick who are there. Tell them the kingdom of God has come near to you. But when you enter a town and are not welcome, go into its streets and say, even the dust of your shoes, even the dust of your town, we wipe from our feet as a warning to you. Yet be sure of this, the kingdom of God has come near. I tell you, it would be more bearable on the day of Sodom than for that day. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But when it will become more bearable for Tyre and Sidon at the judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, you will be lifted to the heavens. Will you be lifted to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades. Whoever listens to you, listens to me. Whoever rejects you, rejects me. Whoever even rejects, I messed that one up. Whoever rejects you, rejects me. Whoever rejects me, rejects him who sent me. All right, let's stop right there. So I read a whole lot. So he's sending them out. What does he say he's sending them out as? How is he sending them? Lamb among wolves. What does that mean? What do you think the implication of that is saying? Sounds like he's sending them out to be eaten. But I think there's something about that. Sometimes, when I said that we have American Christianity, sometimes we don't come as lamb. I think we come as more strong. We come because we have something to offer. We come because we have our culture we want to offer. We come because we have a better way of doing things that we want to offer. And I think Jesus is saying, I'm sending you out as a lamb among wolves. The implication of that is, Jesus made this statement. He's the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. So when we think about a lamb, I think we need to come with a certain posture. And not come in and act like we want to take over. But I think we need to come in a certain way. He says, he's sending them out as lambs among wolves. I would encourage you to do some introspection on that, to think about what that means. I'm sending you out like a lamb among wolves. And then the second thing he says is, and this might hit you kind of hard, he says, do not take a purse or a bag or sandals. Do not greet anyone on the road. When you enter a house, first say peace. So why not take money? Why not take a purse?
Because the scripture says that they will go in the going and stuff and being she's on set.
That's great. That's great because I think that's excellent. That I work with a lot of churches from the South, and sometimes they come and they want to build something. And they're like, well, we want to build something. And I'm thinking, and I have to remind them of this. God was working in Philadelphia before you got here. And what I want you to do is join God on his mission in Philadelphia. Where you're sitting at right now is the work of God. I got a chance to be under the ministry of Pastor Manuel Ortiz when I was at this year's seminary. And it was just something about it. When he stood up, he ministered the gospel classrooms, but it was even his life that let me to know that his vision was huge. And he wanted to see something happen that was beyond him. And it wasn't about finding somebody that could pay for everything that he wanted. It was about inviting God's people to join him on mission and what God wanted to do in the world. All right, we're like I'm losing some people here. Let me keep it moving. Sleep is coming on you. Okay, so he said, if someone who promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will return to you. What are the implications of this idea of peace? Anybody ever here heard of a person of peace? What does it mean to have a person of peace? What type of neighborhood did y'all go to?
Money Park and Big Rock Industries down
Do they have any block captains up there? A block captain? You know what a block captain is? Okay. If the block captain, if you're doing something on a block and the block captain doesn't know, then you kind of made a mistake. Because that's your person that you need to touch. There's also other people who know everything that's going on in the community, and when you're doing things in the community that person knows, they can support you because they have a connection to the relationships. But if you try to go into a community and they don't welcome you, then he's saying, don't force it. Step back. And a lot of times we can't accept that because we think, no, I'm here to help you and you need this help. Sometimes we need to say, okay, they're not ready yet. Let's just step back and pray. Either we enter another time. But let's think about how we're going to do this. Remember, we need to see like Jesus saw. And so he's saying this idea of peace is a really interesting thing because he says when you enter a house, first say peace be with you. If someone who promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will return to you. And what he's saying is that not every place you go, you're going to be welcome. When people look at you, I'm just going to say it out loud, but I'm not being facetious or anything. They come to white saviors again. Coming down here, they only coming for a photo op. They ain't really coming to help anybody. I was in the neighborhood working in Logan, serving the community food during the pandemic and everything like this. And a guy who had been in that community for a long time said, man, you ain't doing that. You ain't giving to the greedy, not the needy. Get out of here, man. We don't need you. But some people, they don't even like the way you're trying to serve. And I'm saying that when you run into obstacles in ministry, you need to think about how you want to do contextual ministry. Because it's not always going to be happy, happy, happy. Because some people have been there long before the community went through this difficult time. And what they want to know is, listen, they want to know is, are you going to have staying power? Is what you do going to have a long-lasting impact in that context? Or is it just for a moment? So that needs to be a commitment to a context. And that's what I love what Esperanza does. So let me just give you a little bit more of this because this is very practical. He says, stay there eating and drinking. It will return to you. And he says, stay there eating and drinking whatever they give you. For the worker deserves his wages. Do not move around from house to house. So he says, if somebody welcomes you into their home, stay there and eat what they give you. So my wife and I went to a family's house up off of Castor Avenue a couple of days ago because their daughter was having some difficulties and they invited us to pray. And what she said was, they were from Pakistan. And he said, we'd like you to stay for dinner. I said, he said, do you like spicy food? I said, yeah, I like spicy food. Her spicy. It was not my spicy. So when I took that first bite, it was like, uh-oh. Now I could have just, but if I was welcoming to their home, and I was praying for their daughter and spending time with them, having a meal was important to that culture. They were saying, we don't like to send you away without giving you a meal because they were welcoming us in. I don't want to disrespect expected. And so, yeah, we ate and we had a good time. But I think these are very practical things about how you engage in a context. And so contextualization is when we affirm that the Bible is the only infallible text that exists. So when you go, I don't want to minimize the scriptures and think they're just there for one reason. If somebody turns to Acts 17:11, I'm going to read this, and I want you to read that as I get ready to get out of the way. It is appropriate to evaluate all other books by the Bible. We encourage our personal search. We encourage our personal search to the scriptures daily to see whether the principles presented by any text or teacher are true. Content that is in accord with biblical truth should be embraced. What is contrary to sound doctrine should be rejected. We're going to do a representative of the kingdom of heaven. What does Acts 17:11 say? Acts 17:11. You have it. So they welcomed, right? And they were like not other Christians because they were receptive to the message of the word, right? And they responded to the gospel. So I don't want you to just think you're going and eating and everything like that. No, you embody the truth of God's word. I'm not dumbing down the gospel. The second thing Stetson says is, we affirm that there is a biblical precedent for using bridges to reach out to others with the gospel. There's a bridge. Can somebody turn to Acts 17:22 and 23? Acts 17:22 and 23. I'm going to wrap it up in a minute, Howard. The fact that Paul mentioned an aspect of the Athenians' idolatrous worship was not a tacit approval of their entire religious system. He was merely utilizing a religious element of their setting, an altar to an unknown God, to connect with his heirs, and a bridge to truth. Similarly, our personal may use elements of their post-cultural worldview to bridge as a bridge to the gospel. This needs to be construed as not be construed as embracing that worldview. It should be noted that Paul not only used their system to connect, he also contrasts elements of it with truth. Our evangelism must go beyond bridges to present the whole unvarnished truth of the gospel. Somebody read Acts 17:22 and 23.
So Paul, standing in the midst of the
Areopagus,
said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, the unknown God. But therefore you worship as unknown. This I proclaim to you."
That's good. There was a connection. There was a bridge. Paul said in 1 Corinthians, he says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For which I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. So we base everything on the gospel. This is the last thing I'm going to issue, okay? Contextualization. We affirm an incarnational approach to missions that is bound by biblical parameters. You got that, Doc? We affirm that. Following the example of him who became flesh, John 1:14 says that, and we beheld him, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So what we want to know is that Jesus became flesh. That's the incarnation, right? John 1:14. It is appropriate that personnel continue to tailor their ministry to their setting. The Apostle Paul likewise embraced this approach. He said this, I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. We advocate that learning and appropriate utilization of language and culture. Constant vigilance is required lest contextualization degenerate into syncretism, where linguistic categories and cultural mores are deficient. These must be challenged and corrected by biblical truth. And you one more. We affirm both the sufficiency and the unique nature of biblical revelation. We deny that any other purported sacred writing is on par with the Bible. While reference to a target people group religion, writing can be made as a part of a bridge building. Care should be exercised not simply to imply a wholesale acceptance of such. He has one more and then I'm out of your way. Okay, somebody turn to 2 Corinthians 4:2 and you can wrap it up with this. This is Stetson. I like Stetson. I think he's a good missionary. He does a lot of good things. I think he's at Wheaton right now. But he says this in the last thing. We affirm the needs of we affirm the need to be ethically sound in our evangelistic methodology. 2 Corinthians 2:4, becoming all things to all men, and an incarnational approach does not necessitate an ethical breach. Jesus instructed his disciples to be as wise as serpents and harmless as doves. We are to be wise in our bridge building. We are to be harmless in our integrity as we go forth the truth. Somebody read 2 Corinthians 4:2.
We reject all shameful deeds and underhanded methods. We don't try to trick anyone or distort the word of God. We tell the truth before God, and all who are honest know this.
It's good. And so let me sum up by saying that as somebody who's been saved out of an urban context, still doing ministry in the first layer of suburbs, but still pastoring a church in the first layer of suburbs, but still doing a lot of ministry in the urban context, working in a public school, that it's possible that if we don't practice those things that I just mentioned, that we will have is somebody that gets our context, but doesn't get our gospel, or somebody that gets the gospel, but doesn't get the context of the sermon. And I think you need to be able to do both. I think you need to have a gospel that stays true to itself with its implications in the context that you're serving. And that will look different in an urban context and a suburban context. Because the suburban context needs the gospel as well. But how you go about communicating the truths of this gospel has to be true in that context just as true as it is in this context. It may take work, but that's the work of contextualization. It doesn't mean just come in, set up a tent. I love Bill Grant, please don't say we hit them. Preach the gospel. This is where they used to do it. Go somewhere, set up a tent, preach the gospel. People get saved. They come forward down the aisle. You start a church. That's not where we at right now. If I can say this, that's not even where your generation's at. A whole lot of work, a whole lot of contextualization, a whole lot of things that you have to do, but you have to remain true to the text as you engage. You're not selling out if you engage. You spend a lot of time listening, building bridges in relationship before you begin to articulate the truth of the gospel. And how you go about doing it can have tremendous impact. I hope I said something that made some kind of sense. So I'm going to pray for you all. And I thank you so much for the time that you allowed me today. Lord, thank you. Thank you for this privilege and this opportunity. Use a baseball analogy. Say they had home run hitters in Pastor Gabe, Haas, and they allowed me to come in and get a buck and get on first base. And I'm grateful for that. Thank you for their patience as we spent time in the Word today, just wrestling around with what it means to be true true ministers of the gospel. Thank you for how you use them today in ministry to meet a need. This COVID thing has us all in bad shape right now. We pray that these first responders, as they go out, whatever field they're studying in, or when they go, Lord God, help them to go as you have sent them. They will be true to the gospel. They will trust that you can give them everything that they need to be faithful to what you call them to do. It's Holly and the other leaders here today. And we just bless them, Lord God. We just thank you for this fellowship we were able to have. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Sure.
Are there any questions?
Well, you did like we were taking that. Yes, sure, I can take some
Anyone
questions.
have a question?
How you doing?
I was just going to ask, do you have any book recommendations generally, or with specificity towards this topic of contextualization?
Yeah, this is a book by a gentleman named Dahadi Lewis. It's called Among Wolves. Let me see, I got it correct. Yeah, Among Wolves. That's the cover title. Among Wolves. My eyeballs back on my thing. Among Wolves, disciple making in the city. Dahadi Lewis, D-H-A-T-I, Dahadi Lewis. Among Wolves, disciple making in the city. That's an excellent read. He's a mentor of mine who pastors the church in Atlanta. Keller is excellent on contextualization. I don't know if you've gotten to this one. Tim Keller, I'm sorry. Tim Keller is excellent. And you're in the city with somebody who does urban ministry that I admire. And he just did a book on urban apologetics that has many authors. Eric Mason. He just did a book on urban apologetics. I just got it, I haven't read it yet. And then that's the last book recommendation I made. So we talk about books all day, man. Gotta find it. Oh, here it is. Urban Apologetics. Urban Apologetics, Restoring Black Dignity with the Gospel. And he has, he's the general editor, but he has several people writing chapters on urban apologetics.
Have you heard of Low Church by Eric Mason?
What's it called?
Low Church.
Oh, yeah. That's,
We did that in our Bible study.
oh, yeah, that's excellent. In fact, you guys should have done him up here. Cost too much? No, yeah, don't be before. Okay. Yeah, this is really good.
Anything, okay, so you are in, where's your church at the moment?
In Elkins Park, that's where we meet right now, but we're looking for a building right
Yeah,
from
you're
St.
right
Paul.
across, basically right across the county.
Cheltenham Ave,
Right.
on the other side.
So anything from your previous context applicable in your current context, or vice versa? How are the lessons, what are the lessons you've learned working in both contexts?
See, the problem is, we meet in Elkins Park, but we do ministry in Logan.
Okay.
And so, part of that could be because I have a heart for the city, and I haven't figured out how to engage. So I need to preach the gospel to myself, and I need to do some incarnational ministry in Elkins Park. But it's just easier for me to go to the urban context, but Elkins Park needs the gospel as well. And so right now we're looking for where God is going to plant us. So I started pastoring this church about 4 years ago, and I'm trying to lead them from just meeting on a Sunday morning to going on mission. And what we're doing now is we do these Dad and Me nights at schools. Dad and Me nights where we go in, we provide a meal for the fathers and fathers with their children, and we have games set up in the gym so fathers can spend time with their children. We've had about 100 dads come out before the pandemic. And because of such need in Philadelphia public school systems, we just do that. And it's easier to do ministry for me because that's my calling. But I need to figure out what that need is in Elkins Park. I don't know if that answers your question. Address those needs in Elkins Park as well.
What's the name of your church?
Believers Bible Fellowship. Believers Bible Fellowship.
And if you didn't understand the reference to Manny Ortiz, he planted Spirit and Truth. And so, yeah. And actually, Deb, she added the Ortiz. I don't know if you remember Deb Vasquez. I called her Deb Vasquez yesterday, and she said Deb Ortiz Vasquez. I'm like, he's Manny's, one of Manny's kids. One of Manny's daughters. She and Liz Ortiz Vargas organized from our children of the late great.
Yes, sir.
Can you speak a word about, you said how like people want to really see what you're doing is going to last. And so, like right now we're here 3 weeks, you know, and I know, I guess our main thing is refer back to Esperanza, right? But, you know, how we entering that in a short-term way, you know.
Are you all from Philly?
No,
You're not from Philly. You come from all over the country. Okay. Yeah, so what impact, you know, when, and you guys are not youth or anything like that, but whenever somebody comes and visits the city, mainly some youth ministries and stuff come here on mission trip, and you probably heard the statement before, I always ask them to go across the street before you go around the world or you go across. So the things that you practice here, take them back to your context. And like I said, it's going to be different when you go back to your context, but there's need there as well. It's just how you meet that need where you come from. So don't be willing to do stuff here that you're not willing to do in your own hometown.
I realize it's probably going to be like different for every person, but how would you describe for your, I'm recognizing what was in this question, like your average person from North Philly, what's the gospel in 30 seconds?
To the average person in North Philly.
Yeah.
How would you share the gospel in 30 seconds to the average person from North Philly?
Yeah.
Average is what's tricking me up.
Yeah.
Because
Or maybe if you have a specific example of a person as like a character in mind.
Because if you talk to somebody in North Philly, you could run into somebody that's that has all kind of weird theories. You know what I mean? It's not like they're like they don't know the Bible. Like they're biblically illiterate. They know just enough Bible to be dangerous. You know what I mean? And so 30 seconds could be a long time. If you validate share the gospel, 30 seconds.
Maybe a better question is like, what are the essential elements of the gospel that you carry into a gospel conversation?
Essential. Ask that again.
Like,
Because I want to make sure I hear it.
Yeah, what are the essential elements of the gospel that you carry into any gospel conversation? I realize how you line those up and how you describe it is probably going to be different for everybody, but what are you never going to leave out?
Well, I'm never leaving out the cross.
Yeah.
I'm never leaving out the cross. And I gotta have a resurrection. So I was listening to somebody say this, and I'm one that's more asks for permission sometimes, and you shouldn't have to. But I listen to a lot of people's conversations, right? And I'll say, if you're wondering why I'm not speaking on certain things, we can talk about sports, and I can get into heated debate with them about why Phoenix lost last night. I can talk about why the Sixers lost. Everybody know that's right? You know, but when it comes to religious conversations, I listen a lot, And then I'll say, can I tell you what I believe? And if they say, yeah, I want to hear what you believe, that gives me an open door to say, I heard everything you were talking about, but have you considered? And then I can share biblical thought or interject a biblical thought. They have been way off on. Like we be talking about an Old Testament passage or something like that. I'm like, where'd you get that from? You know what I mean? That's total eisegesis, so you just read into that there's something's not there. But before I just jump on it and say you're wrong, I do a lot of listening. And then I say, man, I wish I could give my opinion. And I said, do you mind if I share my opinion on that? It's going to end up being a long conversation, but you gotta do a lot of discussion. They may not end up believing you, and a lot of times my cover is blown because they say, you're a pastor. My cover's blown, you know what I mean? Because pastors can get a little preachy, you know what I mean? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm big on relationship, huge on relationship. So I do a lot of listening, spend time with people before I even open my mouth and start talking about Jesus. I try to fly under the wire as long as I can before I get an opportunity to share. And you guys can play that role amazing. Are you guys going to be doctors? Doctors, nurses? So you guys, I always ask myself when I go up to a doctor's office, I say, man, I want to hear this person. But I don't want to do that on my first visit, my second visit. And if my doctor was a Christian, I'd be heading to the law. But anyway, that's all I'm saying. So thank you so much, guys. I know.
Thank you.